By January of 1933, our whole world had shrunk to the size of our kitchen, and survival came down to what I could measure. The kitchen is smallest in winter. I don't mean the walls move, though sometimes, when the frost makes patterns on the window that look like the lace I can no longer afford, I almost believe they do. I mean that cold makes everything contract: the light, the day, the portions, the hope. By January of 1933, our whole world had shrunk to the size of this room, where the icebox hums its failing song and the bread box holds more than bread. My name is Mabel Hargrove, and I am 36 years old, though my hands look 50. I have been a seamstress for 18 years, a wife for 14, and a mother for 11. I have remade every dress I own at least twice. I have let out hems for my daughter Ruth and let in seams for myself as the rationing makes us thinner, reshaping us like old garments turned inside out to hide the wear. I know the weight of a yard of cotton. I know how many stitches fit in an inch. And I know, to the button, how much oatmeal will keep us alive until spring. This is the story of how I learned to measure everything, how a horn button from my husband's coat became the tool that kept my family from starving, how a kitchen became a temple of small mathematics, where love was portioned out in quarter inches and hope was something you could hold between your thumb and forefinger. It is the story of 1 year, November 1932 to November 1933, when the country was broken and we were breaking with it, and the only thing standing between us and nothing at all was my ability to count, to divide, to make less look like enough. The button is still in my bread box, smaller now, not the horn one, but another. I keep it there not because I need it anymore, but because I cannot forget what it taught me: that survival is a kind of sewing, that you take what's torn and you measure carefully and you stitch it back together, one small piece at a time, until the shape of a life emerges again from the scraps. The bank failed on a Thursday. Not our bank. We'd never had enough money to worry about banks. But Mr. Pritchard's bank, the Mechanics' Trust on Liberty Avenue, where half the neighborhood kept their savings. Edward came home at noon that day, which was wrong because he never came home at noon. He'd been let go from the machine shop in April, but he still left every morning at 7 as if he had somewhere to be, walking the streets looking for work, checking back at places that had already told him no, standing in lines at employment offices where 200 men competed for 3 positions. But that Thursday he came home at noon, and his face was gray. "Pritchard's bank," he said, and I knew before he finished. "Line around the block. Police had to come. They're saying everything's gone." I was at the kitchen table, hemming a dress for Mrs. Carmichael on Highland Avenue, taking in the waist, letting out the hips, the way bodies reshape themselves under stress. I set down my needle and looked at Edward, really looked at him. He'd lost weight since April. We all had, but it showed differently on a man. His collar gaped. His belt had new holes punched in it, crude holes he'd made himself with an ice pick because we couldn't afford to have it done properly. "How much did we have there?" I asked, though I knew the answer. "Nothing," he said. "We never had enough to put anywhere." "Then we're no worse off than we were yesterday." "Mabel." He sat down heavily. "Everyone's worse off. The Hendersons had their house money there. The Kowalskis had everything. Mrs. Chen from the laundry, everything. It's going to get bad." "It's already bad," I said, and went back to my stitching. But he was right. It got worse. By the end of November, 3 more shops on Liberty Avenue had closed. The butcher, the hardware store, the bakery where I used to buy birthday cakes back when we celebrated with cake instead of wishes. Mrs. Henderson came by on a Tuesday afternoon. I remember because Tuesday was when I did my own mending, the work I couldn't charge for, and asked if I had any sewing she could pay me for. I don't need anything done, I told her, which was a lie. Everything I owned needed something done to it. Please, she said. I can pay. We have a little still. Just, I need to feel like I'm doing something. I understood that. The need to do something, to move your hands, to create some small piece of order in the chaos. So I gave her a pile of Edward's shirts that needed buttons replaced, and I paid her a quarter, which I couldn't afford, and she cried in my kitchen while she sewed. That night I took inventory. I'd been putting it off, the way you put off looking at a wound because once you see how bad it is, you have to do something about it. But with the Pritchard Bank gone and the shops closing, and Mrs. Henderson crying over shirt buttons, I knew I couldn't wait anymore. I cleared the kitchen table after dinner. Potato soup, thin, 3 potatoes split between 4 people, and eked out with water and a little flour to make it look like more. Ruth and Tommy went to bed. Edward sat by the radio, not turning it on, because electricity cost money, just sitting there as if the wooden box might speak to him anyway. And I began to count. The bread box first. Half a loaf of bread, 2 days old, starting to go stale. I'd make it last 3 more days if I toasted it. A 1/4 pound of butter, wrapped in wax paper. 2 potatoes with eyes beginning to sprout. A jar of water I'd boiled that morning, because the city water had been making Tommy sick. The icebox. A bottle of milk, half full. A piece of cheese, hard and going yellow at the edges. 4 eggs. A little bacon grease saved in a tin. The cupboard. 1 tin of coffee, maybe a week's worth if I made it weak. A canister of oatmeal, perhaps 8 pounds. A bag of flour, 5 pounds, maybe 6. A jar of molasses. Salt. A little pepper. Some dried beans in a cloth sack, a pound or so. The cellar. 3 jars of tomatoes I'd put up in August when the garden was still producing. 2 jars of green beans. 1 jar of pickles. I wrote it all down on the back of an old receipt, itemizing it like a store inventory. Bread, 3 days. Butter, 1 week. Potatoes, 2, for planting. Milk, 2 days. Cheese, 1 week. Eggs, 4. Oatmeal, 8 pounds, 60 days. Flour, 5 pounds, 30 days. Beans, 1 pound. Tomatoes, 3 jars. Green beans, 2 jars. Pickles, 1 jar. I looked at the list and felt my chest tighten. November 1st. Spring planting couldn't happen until April, 5 months away. Even if I stretched everything, even if we ate like birds, we'd run out by February, maybe sooner. "What are you doing?" Edward asked. He'd come to stand behind me, looking over my shoulder at my inventory. "Counting." "I can see that." His voice was flat. "What's the total?" "Not enough," I said. He didn't answer, just put his hand on my shoulder, heavy and warm, and we stood there together looking at the list of everything we had, which was also a list of everything we didn't have, which was also a list of all the days between now and spring when we'd have to make nothing into something. "I'll find work," he said. "I know. I'll find something. I know you will." But I didn't know, and he didn't know. We were both just saying words to fill the space where certainty used to be. That Sunday, Roosevelt won the election. We listened to the returns on the Hendersons' radio. They still had electricity, barely, standing in their parlor with a dozen neighbors, All of us pressed close, waiting to hear if anything would change. When they announced Roosevelt's victory, Mrs. Kowalski started crying. "Thank God," she kept saying. "Thank God, thank God." But Mr. Chen from the laundry just shook his head. "New president won't open the banks," he said. "Won't bring back the jobs. Won't fill the cupboards." "He'll do something," Mrs. Henderson insisted. "He has to do something." "He won't take office until March," Edward said quietly. 4 more months of Hoover. 4 more months. I did the math in my head, counting backward from my inventory. 4 more months meant we'd be into the worst of winter before anything changed, before any programs or policies or promises could possibly help. 4 more months of making 8 pounds of oatmeal feed 4 people, of stretching 5 pounds of flour, of watching the children's ribs begin to show through their nightgowns. When we walked home, 3 blocks, Ruth holding my hand, Tommy riding on Edward's shoulders even though Edward was tired, even though Edward had walked miles that day looking for work, I made a decision. "I need to organize better," I told Edward. "You're already organized." "No, I mean," I searched for the words. "I need a system for the rationing, something I can see, something I can measure. Otherwise, I'll just keep giving them more, and there won't be enough to last." He understood. He'd seen me do it, slipping half my portion onto Ruth's plate, pretending I'd eaten while cooking. "What kind of system?" "I don't know yet, but I'll figure it out." The button came from Edward's good coat, the one he wore to church before there seemed no point in going anymore. Not because we'd lost faith exactly, but because sitting in the pew in threadbare clothes while Reverend Morris talked about abundance felt like a kind of lie we couldn't afford to tell. The coat was hanging in the bedroom closet, mothballed and forgotten. I took it out one evening while Edward was listening to the Hendersons' radio. They'd invited him over to hear Roosevelt's first fireside chat, though Roosevelt wouldn't take office for months yet. I spread the coat on the bed and looked at it. Good wool, dark gray, barely worn. The buttons were horn, real horn, the color of weak tea. 3/4 of an inch across, 4 holes. I cut one off. It felt like vandalism at first, snipping through the thread that held it, feeling the button drop into my palm. But Edward hadn't worn the coat in months. He wasn't going to wear it again anytime soon, not to church, not to job interviews. The shops that were hiring didn't care about good wool coats. They cared about strong backs and empty stomachs and desperation, and we had plenty of all 3. I took the button to the kitchen and laid it on the table next to the oatmeal canister. The oatmeal was down to about 7 pounds now. I'd been through it twice since my inventory, making breakfast, making evening porridge, sometimes just making a spoonful for Tommy when he cried that his stomach hurt. I poured the oatmeal out into a mixing bowl, all of it, a pale mountain of flakes. Then I got a tin cup from the cupboard, the same cup I used for measuring flour, and I began to portion. 1 cup of oatmeal, I'd learned, made enough porridge for 4 people if you added water and cooked it long and thin. 1 cup was approximately 3/4 of an inch tall when you poured it into the tin cup, the same width as the button. I held the button next to the cup. Perfect, 3/4 of an inch. I began to divide the oatmeal into cups, counting as I went. 7 pounds was roughly 21 cups. 21 cups was 21 breakfasts. 21 days. November 13th to December 4th. Not enough. Not nearly enough. But now I could see it. I could measure it. And what you can measure, you can ration. I put the oatmeal back in the canister and laid the button on top, pressing it down slightly so it made a small depression in the surface. Tomorrow morning, I'd measure 1 cup, 1 button's height for breakfast. The day after, the same. 21 days of certainty. Then I'd figure out what came next. Mama? I turned. Ruth was standing in the doorway in her nightgown, barefoot on the cold linoleum. You should be in bed, sweetheart. I heard you moving around. She came closer, looking at the button on the table. What's that? A button from Daddy's coat. Why is it on the table? I could have said anything. Could have made up a story about mending, about sewing, about any of the 1,000 things mothers tell children to keep them from worrying. But Ruth was 9 years old and smart, and she'd already noticed the smaller portions, the missing treats, the way I said, "not right now," when she asked for things that used to be easy yeses. I'm using it to measure, I told her. Measure what? How much oatmeal we can have each day. She picked up the button, turning it over in her hand. It caught the light from the overhead bulb, gleaming dully. It's small. Yes. So we can't have very much. We'll have enough, I said. The button makes sure we'll have enough. She looked at me with those serious brown eyes, so much older than 9. Does Daddy know about the button? Not yet. Are you going to tell him? Eventually. She nodded, understanding something I hadn't said, that this was my work, my domain, my problem to solve. That Edward was carrying enough weight already without knowing exactly how I was keeping us alive, button by button, measurement by measurement. Can I help? She asked. Tomorrow, I said. Tomorrow you can help me measure. She put the button back on the table, carefully, as if it were something precious. Maybe it was. By the end of November, the button system had expanded beyond oatmeal. Flour. The button laid flat on the table, I discovered, was roughly the same diameter as the amount of flour needed for 1 day's worth of bread, a small loaf, flat and dense, but bread nonetheless. 5 pounds of flour meant approximately 30 days of bread if I measured exactly, if I didn't spill, if I didn't make mistakes. Butter. The button's thickness, maybe 1/8 of an inch, was the amount of butter I could spare per day for all 4 of us. A scraping on bread, a tiny bit melted over potatoes, nothing extra. The 1/4 pound I had would last a week, maybe 8 days. Beans. A handful the size of the button's circumference was 1 serving. 1 pound of dried beans soaked and cooked would make 7 meals for 4 people if I added enough water and maybe some tomatoes from the cellar jars. Coffee. The button's thickness in grounds, boiled twice and used a 3rd time just for the color, made enough weak coffee to last me 3 days. Edward had given up coffee entirely. Save it for yourself, he'd said. You're working. By working, he meant the sewing, the mending, the occasional dress alteration for ladies who still had money for such things. But we both knew I was also working here, in the kitchen, doing this strange mathematics of survival. I kept the button in the bread box now, in the front right corner, always in the same spot. Every morning I'd open the bread box and take out the button, and I'd use it to measure the day's portions. 3/4 of an inch of oatmeal in the measuring cup, a button's diameter of flour, a button's thickness of butter. The button had become my rule, my standard, my way of making the impossible possible. Ruth helped me. She'd wake up early, 6 o'clock, before Tommy, before Edward, and she'd come to the kitchen and watch me measure. Sometimes she'd hold the button while I poured. Sometimes she'd mark the level in the cup with her finger so I could see exactly where 3/4 of an inch fell. She never complained, never asked for more. Just helped me portion out the day, quiet and serious, like we were performing some kind of ritual, which I suppose we were. One morning, November 28th, Thanksgiving, I used the button to measure out something special. I'd been saving a little sugar, a tablespoon here and there, from what Mrs. Carmichael paid me with sometimes instead of coins. I'd hidden it in a jar in the back of the cupboard, waiting for a reason. Thanksgiving seemed like reason enough. I measured 1 button's worth of sugar, maybe 2 tablespoons, and I mixed it with a button's worth of butter, and I spread it on 4 pieces of toasted bread. Sugar toast. We used to have it all the time before. Ruth's favorite. I put the plates on the table and called everyone to breakfast. Tommy came running. "What's that smell?" "Sugar toast," I said. His eyes went wide. "Really?" "Really." Edward came in from the bedroom, pulling on his shirt. He looked at the plates and then at me. "Mabel." "It's Thanksgiving," I said. We sat down together, the 4 of us, and we ate our sugar toast slowly, making it last. Tommy licked his plate. Ruth closed her eyes while she chewed, like she was trying to memorize the taste. Edward reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For making it feel like Thanksgiving." But it didn't feel like Thanksgiving. Not really. Thanksgiving was supposed to be turkey and stuffing and mashed potatoes and pie and family around a crowded table, laughing and full. This was 4 people and 4 pieces of sugar toast and a button in a bread box, measuring out survival. Still, we were together. We were alive. The button said we'd make it to December. That was something to be thankful for. And stayed cold. By the 10th, snow covered the ground and didn't melt. By the 15th, the pipes froze in the Kowalskis' apartment, and they had to come stay with the Hendersons, 7 people in a 3-room flat. By the 20th, the temperature dropped below 0 and stayed there, and the city seemed to contract around us like a fist closing. The kitchen shrank. I don't mean physically, though we did start spending more time crowded around the stove, the only source of heat we could afford to keep running, but psychologically. The walls pressed in, the ceiling lowered. Every day felt smaller, tighter, more desperate than the last. The button kept us sane. Every morning, 3/4 of an inch of oatmeal. Every evening, a button's diameter of flour mixed with water and baked into flatbread. Twice a week, a handful of beans the size of the button's circumference, soaked overnight and cooked with a jar of tomatoes from the cellar. Once a week, 1 egg per person, scrambled thin with milk and served on toast. Ruth had taken to drawing pictures of the button. She'd sketch it in her school notebook during arithmetic class. The teacher sent a note home asking if everything was all right. Was Ruth getting enough to eat? Did we need help from the church relief fund? I wrote back saying we were fine, thank you. Ruth was just artistic. The lie came easily. We weren't fine. But we weren't charity cases either. Not yet. Tommy stopped complaining about being hungry. That worried me more than the complaining ever had. He'd just sit at the table, with his 2 big eyes in his 2 thin face, and eat what I gave him and say, "Thank you, Mama," in this small, polite voice that made me want to scream. "He's being good," Edward said one night, after the children were in bed. "He's giving up," I said. "Don't say that." "It's true. He's 6 years old and he's giving up." Edward looked at me for a long moment. Then, "So what do we do?" "We measure," I said. "We keep measuring, and we make it to spring." Christmas came and went like a whisper. We couldn't afford a tree, couldn't afford presents, couldn't afford any of the things that made Christmas feel like Christmas. But on Christmas morning, I used the button to measure out something special. A double portion of oatmeal for everyone, sweetened with a little molasses and a tiny scraping of butter. Luxury. Ruth gave me a drawing she'd made at school, our family, 4 stick figures holding hands, and in the corner, carefully drawn, a button. For the bread box, she'd written underneath. Tommy gave Edward a paper crown he'd made from newspaper, painted gold with school paint. "So you can be king," he said. "Kings don't have to look for work." "Kings have harder jobs than that," Edward told him. But he wore the crown all morning, and I saw him fold it carefully and put it in his coat pocket before he left for his shift at Schneider's. I gave everyone a new pair of socks I'd knitted from yarn I'd unraveled from an old sweater of mine. 4 pairs of socks from one sweater. Another kind of multiplication. Another way of making less into more. Edward gave me the button. "I know you already have it," he said, "but I wanted you to know I see it. I see what you're doing, with the measuring and the rationing and keeping us all alive. So." He pressed the button into my hand. Official-like. "It's yours." I closed my fingers around it. The horn was warm from his pocket, smooth and solid. "It was always mine," I said. "I know, but now it's official." Later, after the children were in bed, after the house was quiet except for the wind rattling the windows and the furnace grumbling in the basement, Edward and I sat at the kitchen table and did inventory. It had become our ritual, this accounting. Once a month, on the 1st, we'd take stock of what we had and what we needed, and how long we could last. December 25th, 1932. Oatmeal, 6 pounds. Current rate, 18 days remaining. Flour, 4 pounds. Current rate, 24 days remaining. Beans, 8 ounces. Current rate, 3 meals remaining. Butter, gone. Sugar, 3 tablespoons, hidden jar. Milk, gone, too expensive. Eggs, 2, from Mrs. Henderson, who kept chickens. Tomatoes, 2 jars, cellar. Green beans, 1 jar, cellar. Pickles, 1 jar, cellar. Potatoes, 3, sprouting for planting. Money, $3.47, middle drawer. Expected income, $8 per week, Edward's dock work, plus whatever I could earn from selling. I looked at the numbers and felt the familiar tightness in my chest. 18 days of oatmeal, 24 days of flour. And it was only December 25th. Spring was 3 months away. "We need more," I said. "I can ask Schneider for extra shifts. I can take in more sewing. The cellar jars won't last forever. We'll get more when the garden comes in. The garden won't come in until June." We looked at each other across the table, across the inventory sheet, across the gulf between what we had and what we needed. "We'll make it," Edward said finally. "We have the button." He meant it as a joke, sort of, but it was also true. We had the button. We had the system. We had a way of measuring, of making less into enough, of stretching 18 days into 21, 24 days into 30. The button was our mathematics, our liturgy, our prayer. And so far, it had kept us alive. January was gray. Not just the weather, though it was that too. Week after week of overcast skies and dirty snow, and temperatures that never quite rose above freezing. But everything. The color seemed to drain out of the world. The kitchen walls looked grayer. The children's faces looked grayer. Even food looked gray. The endless rotation of oatmeal and bread and bean soup, pallid and monotonous. I began to dream about color. Red apples, orange carrots, green lettuce, yellow butter, the bright pink of salmon, the deep purple of beets. I'd wake up remembering summers, the garden full of tomatoes and peppers and squash, the table crowded with plenty. And then I'd open my eyes to January and gray, and the button in the bread box, measuring out another gray day. Ruth got sick first. Just a cold, we thought. Runny nose, cough, the usual winter misery. But it hung on. A week, 2 weeks, 3. She couldn't shake it. The school nurse sent her home with a note saying she needed better nutrition, more rest, maybe some cod liver oil. Cod liver oil, I said to Edward that night, because if I didn't laugh, I'd cry. She might as well have prescribed caviar. Edward didn't laugh. How much does it cost? Doesn't matter, we can't afford it. How much? I'd seen it at Morrison's, 85 cents for a small bottle. Almost a week of Edward's wages. Almost 2 weeks of oatmeal. Too much, I said. But Edward went to Schneider's the next morning and asked for extra shifts, and he came home late that night with $3 and a cough of his own. And the day after that, I went to Morrison's and bought the cod liver oil. 85 cents plus tax. I counted the coins into Mr. Morrison's hand, and he wrapped the bottle carefully and gave me a stick of peppermint for Ruth. "Tell her it'll help the taste," he said. The cod liver oil worked. Within a week, Ruth's cough eased. Within 2 weeks, she was back at school. But now Edward couldn't shake his cough. It got worse, deeper. He'd wake up in the night hacking, trying to muffle it so he wouldn't wake the children, and I'd lie there listening to him and thinking about the mathematics of illness, how it cost money we didn't have, time we couldn't spare, strength we'd already spent. "You should stay home," I told him one morning, when his cough was so bad he could barely speak. "Can't," he rasped. "Rent's due Friday." The rent was $12 a month. Edward's dock work brought in maybe $8 a week if he didn't miss shifts, if Schneider had work, if his cough didn't get him sent home. My sewing brought in another $2 or $3 a week, if the ladies kept calling, if I could finish quickly enough to take multiple jobs. $12. It might as well have been $1,200. February was worse than January. Not grayer, that would have been impossible, but colder. Colder in the way that makes your bones ache, that makes you stop believing in spring, that makes you understand why animals hibernate, because sleep, at least, is warm and safe and free. The oatmeal ran out on February 8th. I'd stretched it as far as it would go, measuring it button by button, making it thinner and thinner until it was basically hot water with oat residue. But on the morning of February 8th, I opened the canister, and there was nothing left but dust. I stood there, holding the empty canister, the button in my other hand, and I felt something inside me crack. Ruth came into the kitchen. "Is it breakfast time?" "Almost," I said. My voice sounded normal, which was strange because I didn't feel normal. I felt like I was breaking apart. "Go wake your brother." When she left, I sat down at the table and I let myself feel it. The fear, the exhaustion, the crushing weight of keeping everyone alive when there wasn't enough to keep anyone alive. I let myself feel it for exactly 60 seconds, counting them off in my head. 60 seconds of breaking. Then I stood up, washed my face at the sink, and figured out what came next. What came next was bread soup. I baked a loaf of the flatbread, a button's diameter of flour, water, a pinch of salt, and while it was hot, I tore it into pieces and put it in 4 bowls. Then I heated water with a little bacon grease and a tiny scraping of butter and poured it over the bread. Bread soup. Hot and filling enough to trick your stomach into thinking you'd eaten. "What's this?" Tommy asked. "Something different," I said. "Try it." He tried it. "It's good," he said, which was a lie. It was terrible, bread and grease water. But he was 6 and hungry, and we'd taught him not to complain. Edward looked at his bowl, and then at me, and I saw him understand. The oatmeal was gone. This was what came next. He picked up his spoon. I found work that week. Not sewing, something else. Mrs. Carmichael's sister needed help with her spring cleaning, and Mrs. Carmichael recommended me. 50 cents for a full day's work, 8 to 6, scrubbing floors and washing windows and beating rugs. I took it. The work was hard. Harder than sewing, which at least let you sit down. This was on your knees, in cold water, with lye soap that cracked your hands and made them bleed. But it was 50 cents, and it was one day, and 50 cents bought 5 pounds of oatmeal, or 3 pounds of beans, or a dozen eggs, or rent toward the rent. I came home that night so tired I could barely stand. Edward took one look at me and put me in a chair and made me sit while he heated water for washing. Ruth brought me a towel. Tommy brought me the button. I don't know why, he just brought it and put it in my hand, like it was medicine. "Did you make enough?" Edward asked. 50 cents. That's good. It's something. I bought oatmeal the next day. 5 pounds, 60 cents including tax, which meant I still owed 10 cents, and promised Mr. Morrison I'd pay him next week. He said fine. Everyone in the neighborhood was running tabs at Morrison's by then. He had a ledger behind the counter, 2 inches thick, every page filled with names and amounts owed. Henderson, $3.47. Kowalski, $6.23. Chen, $2.18. And now us. Hargrove, 10 cents. We were on the books. We were official. We were charity cases. I took the oatmeal home and put it in the canister and measured out 3/4 of an inch with the button and made breakfast for the next morning. And I didn't let myself think about how 5 pounds wouldn't last nearly as long as 8 pounds had, or about how we were going backward instead of forward, or about how February still had 2 weeks left and March would be even harder. I just measured, button by button, day by day. That was all I could do. On February 23rd, Edward came home in the middle of the day. Not because he'd been let go, though I thought that at first, my heart dropping like a stone, but because there was news. "Roosevelt's doing something," he said, breathless, still in his coat. "I heard it at the warehouse. He's starting some kind of program. Emergency relief, public works. They're saying there'll be jobs, real jobs, government jobs." "When?" I asked. "He takes office March 4th. After that, they're saying weeks, maybe a month." Weeks, a month. In the meantime, we had 3 pounds of oatmeal, 9 days at current rationing, 2 pounds of flour, 12 days, maybe a pound of beans, 1 jar of tomatoes, 1 jar of green beans, the pickle jar we'd been avoiding because once the cellar was empty, it would stay empty until summer. March 4th was 9 days away. Then, however long it took Roosevelt to actually do something, sign bills, create programs, hire people, distribute money. Say 2 weeks, optimistically. 3 weeks, more realistically. Could be a month. Could be longer. I did the math. We'd run out of food again before the relief came. Even with the button measuring, even with me taking every cleaning job I could find, even with Edward working 6 days a week at the warehouse, we'd run out. "We'll make it," Edward said, reading my face. "You don't know that. I know you. You'll figure it out. You always do." But I didn't feel like someone who figured things out. I felt like someone who was drowning, going under for the 3rd time, watching the surface get farther away. That night I opened the middle drawer, the drawer of possible things, and I counted my emergency fund. 3 pennies from last year, 2 dimes from Mrs. Carmichael, 3/4 from Mrs. Hogan, a nickel I'd found in the street in January. Total, 98 cents. Almost $1. Almost enough to matter. I held the coins in my hand, and I thought about what they could buy. Oatmeal, flour, beans, butter, eggs, milk, coffee. Each one represented a choice, a trade-off, a decision about what we needed most and how long we needed it to last. In the end, I bought 5 pounds of flour and a pound of beans. $1 even, my entire emergency fund, gone in one transaction. But it was flour and beans, and they'd keep us alive another 2 weeks, maybe 3 if I measured carefully, if I used the button, if I made less into enough one more time. March came in like a lamb, which was a mercy. The temperature rose above freezing. The snow started to melt. You could see the sidewalk again, gray concrete instead of gray ice. But still, it was something different, a change, proof that winter could end. On March 4th, the whole neighborhood gathered at the Hendersons' apartment to listen to Roosevelt's inauguration. The Hendersons had sold their radio in February. They'd been about to. But then everyone pitched in a little money to keep it. Because what was the point of surviving the Depression if you couldn't hear the man who might end it? Their front room was packed. 15, maybe 20 people, all of us pressed together, quiet, listening to the static-filled broadcast from Washington. Roosevelt's voice came through thin and distant, but clear enough. Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Mrs. Kowalski started crying again. Mr. Chen nodded slowly. The Hendersons held hands. Edward put his arm around my shoulders and pulled me close, and I let myself lean into him, let myself believe for a moment that words might be enough, that a voice on the radio might actually change something. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. I thought about fear, about how I'd been afraid every single day since November, maybe longer. Afraid the food would run out, afraid Edward would stop coming home, afraid Ruth would get sick again, afraid Tommy would stop growing, afraid the rent would go unpaid, afraid the button would fail, afraid I would fail. But I'd measured anyway, portioned anyway, cooked anyway, kept us alive anyway. Maybe that was what Roosevelt meant. Maybe surviving fear wasn't about not being afraid. Maybe it was about measuring carefully, even when your hands were shaking. About dividing the oatmeal, even when there wasn't enough. About putting one foot in front of the other, even when you couldn't see the end. This nation asks for action, and action now. The room erupted in cheers when the speech ended. People hugging, crying, laughing. Mrs. Henderson brought out cookies she'd been saving, real cookies, with sugar and butter, and passed them around, one per person, a celebration. I ate mine slowly, making it last. It was the sweetest thing I'd tasted since Christmas. By mid-March, the news started coming through in pieces, like spring itself. A little bit here, a little bit there. Not quite enough to count on, but enough to hope. Roosevelt had declared a bank holiday, closing all the banks to stop the panic. He'd started something called the Civilian Conservation Corps, putting young men to work on public lands. He'd introduced an emergency banking bill to Congress. None of it helped us directly. Not yet. Edward was still working 2, maybe 3 days a week at Schneider's. I was still taking whatever cleaning work I could find. The button was still measuring out portions that got smaller and smaller as our supplies dwindled. But there was a feeling in the air, a shift. People started talking differently, not just about surviving, but about what came after surviving. What we'd do when things got better. The gardens we'd plant, the debts we'd pay off, the small luxuries we'd allow ourselves, a new dress, a real pair of shoes, a meal at a restaurant. What would you want? Edward asked me one night. When things get better. A roast, I said immediately. A big pot roast with carrots and potatoes and gravy. That's all? And pie. Apple pie. He smiled. I'd want to take you dancing. Remember dancing? I did remember. Saturday nights at the hall on Liberty Avenue. A three-piece band and crepe paper decorations, and all of us young and stupid, and sure that things would just keep getting better forever. Edward had been a terrible dancer, all left feet and apologies, but he'd never cared, just kept pulling me onto the floor anyway. We'll go dancing, I promised. When things get better. When things get better, he echoed, and we both pretended we believed it. The cellar jars ran out in late March. First, the tomatoes. I'd been stretching them, using half a jar at a time, making them last. Then the green beans. Then finally the pickles, which we'd been saving because nobody really liked pickles, but at least they were food. At least they were something. The day I opened the last pickle jar, Ruth was helping me in the kitchen. She'd been helping more and more lately, learning to measure with the button, learning to divide portions, learning all the small mathematics of survival that I'd been keeping from her. Is that the last one? She asked, watching me pour the pickle juice into a pot with potatoes and a little flour to make something like soup. Yes. What happens when we run out of everything? It was the question I'd been avoiding for months. The question that lived under every measurement, every calculation, every button width of oatmeal. What happens when we run out? We won't run out, I said. But what if we do? I looked at her, my 9-year-old daughter with her serious eyes and her too thin arms and her drawings of buttons in her school notebook. She deserved better than a lie. If we run out, I said, then we'll figure something else out. We'll go to the relief office. We'll ask the church for help. We'll borrow from the Hendersons or the Kowalskis or someone. We'll do whatever we have to do to keep everyone safe. Would we have to leave the house? No, sweetheart. We're not leaving the house. But I didn't know that. The rent was due in 4 days, and we were $3 short. Edward was picking up every shift he could, but Schneider's was slow. I'd taken 2 cleaning jobs that week, but both ladies had paid me in food instead of cash. A pound of flour from Mrs. Carmichael, half a dozen eggs from Mrs. Hogan's sister. Food was good. Food kept us alive, but food didn't pay the rent. I added the math up in my head for the 1,000th time. Edward's wages, $6 this week. My sewing money, $1.50. My cleaning money, $0 in cash, but flour and eggs, so that was something. Minus rent, $12. Minus what we owed Morrison's, $0.47 now because I'd paid some off. Minus everything else we needed, oatmeal, flour, butter if we could spare it, kerosene for the lamps, soap, coal for the furnace. The numbers didn't work. They never worked. But we were still here, still alive, still measuring with the button and making it stretch. Maybe that was the answer to Ruth's question. What happens when we run out? We measure again. We divide again. We make something out of nothing, one button width at a time. On March 25th, it rained. Not just a drizzle or a shower, but a real rain, the kind that washes everything clean. The snow melted, the streets turned to rivers, the gutters overflowed. And somehow, despite the mud and the cold water seeping through our shoes and the general misery of being wet in March, it felt like hope. Rain meant spring was coming. Spring meant planting. Planting meant food in summer. Summer meant making it through, making it to the other side, surviving. I went out in the rain that afternoon, I had a cleaning job on Highland Avenue, Mrs. Carmichael's sister again, and I couldn't afford to miss it. I wrapped my coat tight and pulled my hat down and walked the 12 blocks in the pouring rain, and when I got there, I was soaked through. Mrs. Carmichael's sister, Mrs. Wallace, took one look at me and said, "Oh, you poor thing. Get those wet things off before you catch your death." She made me tea, real tea, hot and black with a little sugar. She gave me some of her husband's old work clothes to wear, while mine dried by the kitchen stove. And then, instead of having me scrub floors, she had me sit at her kitchen table and help her go through old linens, deciding what to keep and what to give away. "You know about fabric," she said. "You can tell me what's worth saving." We worked for 3 hours, sorting and folding, and she told me about her sister, Mrs. Carmichael, and her children, grown, living in Ohio, and her husband, a foreman at the mill, still working, thank God. And I told her about Ruth and Tommy and Edward, and the kitchen that got smaller in winter, and the button that measured everything. I didn't mean to tell her about the button. It just came out, the way things do when someone is kind to you, and you haven't had much kindness lately. She listened, didn't interrupt, didn't offer advice, just listened. When I finished, she said, "You're keeping them alive." "I'm trying." "No, you are. That's not trying, that's doing." She paid me $1, double what she'd promised, and she sent me home with a box of things from her sorting: sheets, towels, a wool blanket, 3 dresses that didn't fit her anymore, but might fit me or Ruth. "You can alter them," she said. "Make them work." I carried the box home in the rain, clutching it to my chest, the $1 in my pocket feeling like a fortune. A whole $1. That was oatmeal and flour. That was beans and butter. That was rent money. That was survival. When I got home, Edward and the children were in the kitchen. Edward had made bread soup for dinner. He'd learned how to do it, had taken over some of the cooking on days when I was working. The bread was a little thick, not quite right, but it was food, and it was hot, and it was proof that I wasn't the only one measuring anymore, the only one trying to make less into enough. "How was work?" Edward asked. "Good," I said. "Really good." I showed them the box, the $1, the dresses. Ruth held up the smallest dress, pale blue with tiny buttons down the front. "Can I have this one?" "We'll make it fit," I promised. That night, after the children were in bed, Edward and I sat at the kitchen table and updated our inventory. It had become our ritual, this accounting, our way of marking time and progress and survival. March 25th, 1933. Oatmeal, 2 pounds, 6 days remaining. Flour, 1 pound, 6 days remaining. Beans, 4 ounces, 1 meal remaining. Eggs, 6, from Mrs. Hogan's sister. Butter, gone. Sugar, gone. Milk, gone. Cellar jars, all gone. Money, $1.47. The $1 from Mrs. Wallace, plus what was left in the drawer. Edward's expected wages, $6 to $8 per week. My expected wages, $2 to $3 per week. Rent due, April 1st, $12. We were still short, still running out, still living button to button, measurement to measurement. But it was March 25th. Spring was coming. The rain was washing everything clean, and we were still here. April 1st came on a Saturday. The rent was due. We had $9.37. I counted it out on the table 3 times, hoping the total would change, knowing it wouldn't. $9.37. We were $2.63 short. "I'll talk to the landlord," Edward said. "And say what?" That we'll have it next week? That I'm picking up extra shifts? Will you be? He didn't answer, which was answer enough. Schneider's warehouse was slow. Spring meant less shipping, less freight, less work. Edward was lucky to get 2 days a week now, sometimes only one. I'd been taking more cleaning jobs, more sewing work, anything I could find. Last week I'd made $2.40. The week before, $3. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. We could ask the Hendersons for a loan, I said. They don't have anything to loan. The church? No. Edward's voice was flat, final. We'd had this argument before. He wouldn't take charity, wouldn't go to the relief office, wouldn't ask the church, wouldn't put our name on any list that said we couldn't manage on our own. I understood his pride. I even respected it. But pride didn't pay the rent. In the end, Edward went to the landlord with $7, all we could spare without running out of food money, and promised the rest by the 15th. The landlord said fine, but it was the last time. Next month it had better be on time, full amount, or we'd have to find somewhere else to live. Where else? I asked Edward when he came home and told me. Where else would we even go? I don't know, but we won't have to. I'll figure it out. But it was me who figured it out. Or rather, it was the garden. I'd been planning to plant since February, hoarding the 3 potatoes with eyes, saving seeds from last year, thinking about what would grow fast and yield much and keep us alive through summer. But planning and doing are different things, and doing required time and energy and hope, all of which were in short supply. On April 10th, I planted anyway. The garden plot behind our building was maybe 20 feet by 10 feet, shared between 4 apartments. The Kowalskis had used half of it last year, and the Chens had used a quarter, and we'd used the rest. This year nobody else seemed interested. Too tired, too busy, too hopeless. So I claimed it all. I planted the 3 potatoes first, cutting them into pieces, each piece with at least 1 eye. I planted them in rows, 6 inches apart, covering them with dirt and saying a prayer over each one. Let them grow, let them multiply, let them give us enough. Then I planted the beans. I'd been saving seeds from last year, and I'd bought a few more with some sewing money, 10 cents for a packet, highway robbery, but what choice did I have? I planted them along the back fence where they could climb, a whole row of them, 30 plants maybe. Then onions. I'd bought sets from Morrison's, little bulbs that would grow into full onions by summer. 25 sets for 15 cents. I planted them in a row next to the beans. Then carrots. I'd found a packet of seeds in the middle drawer, left over from who knows when. I didn't even know if they'd germinate, but I planted them anyway, broadcasting them across a patch of ground and covering them lightly with soil. Then lettuce. Fast-growing, early season, something we could eat in weeks instead of months. Ruth and Tommy helped. They dug holes and dropped in seeds and covered them with dirt, and Tommy kept asking when the food would come up, and Ruth kept telling him it would take time. Be patient. How much time? Tommy asked. Beans take 60 days, Ruth said, because she'd been listening when I talked about it. Potatoes take 90, carrots take 70, lettuce takes 30. That's a long time. That's how long it takes. He accepted this, the way children accept things adults tell them, and kept planting. By the time we finished, it was late afternoon, and we were all covered in dirt, and my back ached, and my knees ached, and my hands ached. But the garden was planted, every inch of it. Rows and rows of potential food, of possible survival, of hope buried in the ground. I used the button to mark the rows, not to measure. I'd measured everything by hand and eye, spacing by instinct and memory, but to mark. I pressed it into the soil at the end of each row, making a small depression, a button-sized mark that said, "Here, this is where the food will be. This is where we'll survive." The lettuce came up first, tender green shoots pushing through the soil in late April. By mid-May, we were eating salad, actual salad, fresh and crisp and green. I'd forgotten what fresh vegetables tasted like. We all had. Tommy ate 3 bowls of lettuce in one sitting, dressed with a little bacon grease and vinegar, and then complained that his stomach hurt, and we all laughed because it was the good kind of hurt, the too much food kind, the kind we hadn't felt in 6 months. The beans sprouted next, climbing up the fence, their leaves unfurling like little hands reaching for the sun. Then the carrots, a fuzzy green carpet across their patch. Then the onions, sending up tall stalks. And the potatoes. The potatoes were invisible under the ground, but I knew they were there. I'd dig down a little with my fingers sometimes, checking, and I'd feel the developing tubers, small and firm, proof that multiplication was possible, that 3 potatoes could become 30, that less could become more. By early June, the beans were flowering, small white flowers that would become pods that would become food. I checked them every day, sometimes twice a day, like they were my other children, watching them grow. Ruth started drawing the garden instead of the button. Page after page in her notebook, the rows of plants, the fence, the little markers where I'd pressed the button into the soil. Her teacher sent home another note, but this time it said Ruth's artwork was improving. She had a good eye for detail. Had she considered taking art classes? Art classes. As if we had money for art classes. As if we had money for anything beyond food and rent and survival. But still, it was nice to think about. Ruth in an art class, learning to draw something other than buttons and gardens and the small mathematics of getting by. On June 15th, we picked the first beans. Not many, maybe a pound. Enough for one meal, but it was food from our garden, food we'd grown, food that cost us nothing but time and hope and 3 months of waiting. I cooked them simply, just boiled with a little salt, and we ate them hot and tender, and they were the best thing I'd ever tasted. Better than Mrs. Wallace's cookies, better than the Christmas sugar toast, better than anything, because they were ours. We'd made them. We'd grown them from nothing. "Can we have more tomorrow?" Tommy asked. "Not tomorrow," I said. "We have to let them keep growing. But in a few days, yes." "How many days?" 3 or 4, maybe 5. He nodded, accepting this, understanding finally what Ruth had been trying to tell him back in April. That food takes time, that you can't rush it, that you have to be patient and trust that the waiting will be worth it. By late June, the garden was producing steadily. Beans every few days, lettuce and onions as we needed them. Carrots starting to size up, not quite ready, but soon. And the potatoes, I dug up one plant carefully just to check, and there they were. 6 potatoes where there had been 1 piece. Multiplication. Magic. We were eating better than we had in 8 months. Not well, not the way we'd eaten before Edward lost his job, before the Depression, before everything fell apart, but better. Real vegetables, fresh food. Enough that I wasn't measuring every single thing with the button anymore. I still kept the button in the bread box, though. Still touched it sometimes, running my thumb over the smooth horn, remembering what it had taught me. How to measure, how to divide, how to make less into enough. Edward noticed. "You don't need that anymore," he said one evening, watching me touch the button before I started making dinner. "I know." "So why keep it?" "Because I might need it again." He looked at me for a long moment. "You think this'll happen again? Another winter like that?" "I don't know. Maybe. Probably not. But I want to remember how we got through it." "We got through it because of you," he said. "Because you measured and rationed and kept us alive." We got through it because of all of us. You working, Ruth helping, Tommy not complaining, all of us together. And the button, he said, smiling a little. And the button, I agreed. July was hot. The kind of hot that makes you forget winter ever existed. That makes you understand why people used to worship the sun. The garden exploded with growth. Beans and more beans. Lettuce going to seed. I saved some for next year. Onions ready to pull. Carrots getting fat underground. And the potatoes. I dug them up on July 4th, treating it like a holiday because it was a holiday. Independence Day and our independence from hunger, both at once. Edward and the children helped me dig, all of us on our knees in the dirt, pulling up plant after plant and finding treasure underneath. 37 potatoes from 3 planted pieces, some small, some large, some in between, but all of them food, all of them proof that survival was possible. We ate potatoes for a week straight, boiled, baked, fried in a little lard, mashed with butter we could finally afford. Tommy complained that he was tired of potatoes, and Ruth kicked him under the table, and Edward laughed until he cried, because 8 months ago we'd have killed for this problem, this abundance, this luxury of too much food. Save some, I told Edward, for planting next year. How many? 3 should do it. He smiled. 3 into 37. That's good mathematics. That's survival mathematics, I said. Work was better now. Not good. The depression wasn't over, not by a long shot, but better. Edward was working 4 days a week, sometimes 5. Schneider's had picked up some government contracts, hauling materials for WPA projects, and suddenly there was more freight, more loading, more wages. I was still sewing, but now I could afford to be selective. I turned down the cleaning jobs. They paid less and hurt my back, and took time away from other things, and focused on the alterations and mending, the work I was actually good at. I was making $6 a week sometimes, $7 if I took a rush job. Combined with Edward's wages, we were bringing in $15 or $16 a week. The rent was $12 a month. Food was maybe $8 or $9 a week, now that we weren't rationing so strictly. Coal and kerosene and other necessities were maybe $3 or $4 a week. We were breaking even. Sometimes we were even a little ahead. I started a new emergency fund in the middle drawer. Not replacing the one I'd spent in February. That was gone, spent on survival. But starting fresh. A dime here, a quarter there. Small amounts that added up slowly but steadily. By the end of July, I had $2.35 saved. By the end of August, $4 and change. It wasn't much, but it was a cushion. It was insurance. It was proof that we could survive not just day to day, but week to week, month to month. That we could plan for the future instead of just reacting to the present. In August, Mrs. Carmichael asked me to make her a new dress. Not alter an old one, make a new one, from scratch. With fabric she'd bought at the department store downtown. Good fabric, navy blue with tiny white flowers. "Can you do it?" she asked. "Of course," I said, though I hadn't made a dress from scratch in over a year. Hadn't had reason to. But I remembered how. The cutting and pinning and stitching, the careful shaping to make fabric conform to a body, to create something beautiful and useful from flat cloth. She paid me $5. $5 for one dress. More than I made in a week sometimes. More than we'd spent on food in a month during the worst of winter. I took the money home and I put it in the drawer with the emergency fund, and I stood there looking at it. All these coins and bills, this small fortune, this proof that things were different now, that we'd made it through, that survival wasn't just about getting by anymore, but about building something, saving something, planning for tomorrow instead of just struggling through today. Ruth found me standing there. "What are you doing, Mama?" "Counting," I said. "Counting what?" "Everything we have." She came and stood next to me, looking into the drawer. The emergency fund. The button, still in the bread box, but I'd put another one in the drawer too, a spare, just in case. Some thread and needles and pins. A packet of bean seeds I'd saved. 2 birthday candles left over from Tommy's party. The pencil stub, the piece of twine. "It doesn't look like very much," she said. "It's enough," I told her. And it was. It was exactly enough. September came golden and clear, the air crisp, the light slanting long through the kitchen window in the late afternoon. The garden was winding down. The beans were done, the lettuce long gone to seed, the carrots mostly pulled and stored in the cellar in a box of sand to keep them fresh. But the onions were curing on the back porch, 12 fat bulbs that would last us through winter. And I'd bought seeds for a fall crop of lettuce, planting them in late August, gambling on a few more weeks of salad before the frost came. The Hendersons invited us over for Sunday dinner in early September. Not because we needed charity, things were better now, we were managing, but because they wanted to celebrate. Mr. Henderson had gotten steady work with the WP Way, building roads, 40 hours a week at decent wages. They were back on their feet. They wanted to share. Mrs. Henderson made a roast, chicken, not beef, but still a roast, with potatoes and carrots and gravy. She'd even made pie, apple pie with a lattice crust. There were 8 of us crowded around their table, the 4 Hendersons, the 4 Hargroves, and we ate until we were full, really full. And then we ate a little more just because we could. After dinner, Mr. Henderson brought out his violin. I'd forgotten he played. And he played while we sang. Old songs, folk songs, hymns, anything we could remember. Mrs. Kowalski came up from downstairs and joined us. The Chens came over from next door. The evening turned into a party, impromptu and joyful, the kind of gathering we used to have before the Depression, before everything got hard. At one point, Edward pulled me aside, into the Hendersons' kitchen where it was quieter. "You doing okay?" he asked. "I'm fine. Why?" "You look like you're about to cry." I'm just... I stopped, started again. "I'm just glad that we're here, that we made it." He pulled me close, and I let myself lean into him, let myself feel the relief and the exhaustion and the lingering fear that it might all fall apart again. "We did make it," he said into my hair. "You made it. You kept us alive." "We kept us alive," I corrected. "All of us." "And the button," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "And the button," I agreed. On September 30th, I did inventory one more time. Not because I needed to. We had food, we had money, we were managing. But because it had become ritual, this accounting, this measuring of what we had and what we needed and where we stood. September 30, 1933. Oatmeal, 10 pounds, plentiful. Flour, 8 pounds, plentiful. Beans, 3 pounds, dried, plus homegrown and dried. Potatoes, 34, stored in cellar, holding 3 for spring planting. Carrots, 18, stored in cellar in sand. Onions, 12, curing on porch. Butter, yes, available. Sugar, yes, available. Milk, yes, available. Eggs, yes, available. Coffee, yes, available. Money, $9.78, emergency fund. Edward's wages, $12 to $15 per week. My wages, $5 to $7 per week. Rent, current. Morrison's tab, paid in full. I looked at the list and felt something loosen in my chest, some knot that had been tied since November 1932, since the bank failed and Edward lost his job, and winter came, and everything contracted to the size of a kitchen and a button, and the question of how to make nothing into something. We'd done it. Somehow, against odds that seemed impossible, we'd survived. October was beautiful. Not just the weather, though that was beautiful too, cool and clear with leaves turning gold and red and orange, but the feeling of it. The sense that we'd passed through something difficult and come out the other side. Edward was working steady now, 5 days a week at Schneider's, and there was talk of expansion, of new government contracts, of raises. He came home tired but not gray, exhausted but not defeated. The work was wearing on his body, but not his soul. I'd taken on an apprentice of sorts, a young woman from down the street, Martha, whose husband had lost his job and who needed to learn a trade. I was teaching her to sew, to alter, to make do and make new. She paid me $1 a week for the lessons, but more important, she was learning what I'd learned, that survival is a skill, that making do is an art, that there's dignity in careful work, even when the work is born of desperation. Ruth was back in school, doing well, still drawing but also writing now, stories about families and gardens and winters that end. Her teacher said she had talent. She said Ruth might be a writer someday, or an artist, or both. Tommy had stopped being so thin. His cheeks had filled out. His ribs didn't show. He was loud and messy and complained about homework and asked for seconds at dinner, and every bit of it was wonderful because it meant he was just a regular 7-year-old again, not a small, starving creature trying to be brave. On November 1st, I took the button out of the bread box. Not to get rid of it, I'd never get rid of it, but to look at it, really look at it. Horn, real horn, the color of weak tea, 3/4 of an inch across, 4 holes. The button that had measured our survival for a year. It looked smaller than I remembered. Ordinary. Just a button. But I knew better. I knew what it represented. Not just measurements and rationing and the mathematics of making less into enough, but something larger. The idea that survival is possible. That you can break impossible things down into manageable pieces. That you can measure out hope in small increments and make it last. I sewed it back onto Edward's good coat. The coat was still hanging in the closet, still mothballed, still waiting for a reason to be worn. But it was whole again now, all its buttons intact, ready for when things got even better, for when we could afford to go to church again, or job interviews again, or wherever people wore good wool coats. Then I took another button, the small white one from Tommy's christening gown, and I put it in the bread box where the horn button had been, in the front right corner, in the same spot. Ruth found it that evening when she was getting bread for dinner. "Mama, why is there a button in here?" "For remembering," I said. "Remembering what?" "How we got through." She held it up to the light. It was half the size of the horn button, thin as a wafer, nearly weightless. Not practical at all. But that wasn't the point. "It's too small to measure anything," she said, echoing what she'd said months ago, when spring was coming and the worst seemed over. "It's exactly right," I told her, echoing what I'd said then. She set it back in the bread box, carefully, in the same corner. And I knew she understood, or was beginning to understand, what the button meant. What it would always mean. That survival is measured in small things. That love can be portioned and divided and stretched. That a mother's job is to take what's broken and measure it and sew it back together, one small stitch at a time. November 12th, 1933. 1 year since I'd started counting, since I'd taken inventory, since I'd begun measuring our survival button by button, day by day. The kitchen didn't feel small anymore. The walls had expanded somehow, or maybe we had, or maybe the feeling of contraction had just been fear all along, and now the fear was gone, or at least manageable, or at least not the only thing I felt when I stood at the stove, or opened the bread box, or looked at my family gathered around the table. Edward and I did inventory that night, our ritual accounting, but it felt different now. Not desperate, not urgent, just honest. Taking stock of what we had and where we were and what came next. November 12th, 1933. Food, plentiful. Money, $12.34, emergency fund. Work, steady. Rent, current. Health, good. Hope? Yes. We looked at the list together, and Edward laughed. That's quite an improvement over last year. It is, I agreed. You think we'll have another winter like that? Another depression year? I don't know. Maybe. The economy's still bad. A lot of people are still out of work. Roosevelt's programs are helping, but they're not enough. Not yet. But we'll be okay, he said. Not a question, a statement. We'll be okay, I confirmed. We know how now, how to measure, how to ration, how to survive. He reached across the table and took my hand. His hands were calloused now from the warehouse work, scarred and rough, but warm, solid, real. The button worked, he said. The button worked, I agreed. Thanksgiving came and we celebrated. Not extravagantly, we still couldn't afford that, but properly. I made a small roast chicken with potatoes from our garden, and carrots from our garden, and onions from our garden. I made bread from scratch. I even made a pie, apple, with a lattice crust I wove carefully, making it look like Mrs. Henderson's. We invited the Hendersons over, and the Kowalskis, and the Chens. Too many people for our small kitchen, but we made it work, squeezing chairs around the table, passing plates, sharing food and stories, and the relief of having made it through. Mr. Henderson said grace before we ate. He thanked God for the food, and for Roosevelt, and for work, and for friends, and for survival. And then he said something I hadn't expected. And we thank God for Mabel, who taught us all how to measure, how to make less into more, how to survive. Everyone looked at me. I felt my face go hot. It wasn't just me, I said. Yes, it was, Mrs. Henderson said. You showed us it was possible, that we could get through. You and your button. Tell them about the button, Ruth said. So I did. I told them about the horn button from Edward's coat, about measuring oatmeal 3/4 of an inch at a time, about portioning flour and butter and beans and hope, about the mathematics of survival, about how something so small and ordinary had become the tool that kept us alive. When I finished, Mrs. Kowalski was crying again, but happy crying this time. We should all have buttons, she said, to remember. You don't need buttons, I said. You just need to know that survival is possible, that you can break big problems into small measurements, that you can make it through, one day at a time. Button by button, Ruth added. Button by button, I agreed. After dinner, after everyone had gone home, after the children were in bed, Edward and I stood in the kitchen doing dishes. The room was warm from the stove, still smelling of roasted chicken and pie. Through the window I could see the garden plot, dark now, empty except for the fall lettuce I'd planted, small green leaves pushing up through the cold soil. You did good, Edward said, handing me a plate to dry. We did good, I corrected. Mabel? He turned to face me, his hands still wet from the dishwater. I need you to hear this. Really hear it. You saved us. When I couldn't find work, when I felt like I was failing, when everything was falling apart, you held us together. You measured and rationed and made less into enough, and you kept us alive. All of us. You did that. I wanted to protest, to say it wasn't just me, that we'd all done it together. But there was truth in what he was saying too. I had done those things. I had measured and rationed and stretched and survived. Not alone, never alone. But I had been the one counting, the one dividing, the one making the button work. Okay, I said finally. Okay, I did it. You did it. We did it. We did it. He agreed, and pulled me close, and we stood there together in our small kitchen, in our survived winter, in our made it through year. And I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. Not just relief that we'd survived, but pride that we'd done it well, that we'd kept our dignity, that we'd helped our neighbors, that we'd taught our children what survival looks like. Button by button, day by day, one small measurement at a time. The kitchen is smallest in winter, I said at the start. But I was wrong about what that meant. It's smallest in winter because that's when everything contracts. The light, the day, the portions, the hope. That's when you learn what you're made of, what your family is made of, what love looks like when it's portioned out in quarter inches and measured against survival. But it's also smallest in winter because that's when you're all pressed together, close enough to keep each other warm, close enough to share, close enough to survive. My name is Mabel Hargrove, and I am 37 years old now, though my hands still look 50. I am a seamstress, a wife, a mother, a gardener, a measurer of small things. I know how to make a yard of cloth into a dress. I know how to make 8 pounds of oatmeal last 21 days. I know how to turn 3 potatoes into 37. I know how to survive. The depression isn't over, not for everyone, not everywhere. There are still people out of work, still families going hungry, still children with too big eyes and too thin faces. Roosevelt's programs are helping, but they're not enough, not yet. The recovery is slow and uneven and uncertain. But we made it through the worst of it. November 1932 to November 1933, the year of the button, the year of careful counting, the year we learned that survival is something you measure out in small increments and divide carefully and stretch as far as it will go. The button is still in my bread box, not the horn one, that's back on Edward's coat where it belongs, waiting for church or interviews or wherever good coats get worn when things are better. A different button, smaller, lighter, less practical. The white one from Tommy's christening gown. I keep it there not because I need it for measuring. I don't, not anymore. We have food now. We have work. We have enough. I keep it there to remember what it felt like to stand in this kitchen with nothing but air and hope and a button, trying to make them add up to survival. To remember what I learned about division and multiplication, about how love can be portioned out and still be infinite, about how a mother's job is to take what's broken and measure it carefully and sew it back together, one small stitch at a time. To remember that when everything contracts to the size of a kitchen and a bread box, and the space between having enough and having nothing, you can still survive. You can still measure. You can still count. 3/4 of an inch at a time, button by button, day by day. The bread box is my altar. The button is my liturgy. And every time I open that box, to take out bread or check the supplies, or just to touch the button and remember, I say a prayer. Thank you for the food we have. Thank you for the family still here. Thank you for the winter we survived. Thank you for teaching me how to measure love. The kitchen is smallest in winter, but we fit anyway. We always have. We always will.